Continue reading Krishna book, chapter 87, Prayers by the Personified Vedas by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. King Parikshit inquired from Sukadeva Goswami about a very important topic in understanding transcendental subject matter. His question was, since Vedic knowledge generally deals with the subject matter of the three qualities of the material world, how then can it approach the subject matter of transcendence, which is beyond the approach of the three material modes? Since the mind is material and the vibration of words is a material sound, how can the Vedic knowledge expressing by material sound the thoughts of the material mind approach transcendence? Descriptions of a subject matter necessitates describing its source of emanation, its qualities and its activities. Such description can be possible only by thinking with the material mind and by vibrating material words. Brahman, or the Absolute Truth, has no material qualities, but our power of speaking does not go beyond the material qualities. How then can Brahman, the Absolute Truth, be described by your words? I do not see how it is possible. To understand transcendence from such expressions of material sound, the purpose of King Parikshit's inquiry was to ascertain from Sukadeva Goswami whether the Vedas ultimately describe the Absolute Truth as impersonal or as personal. Understanding of the Absolute Truth progresses in three features: impersonal Brahman, Paramatma, localized in everyone's heart, and at last the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. The Vedas deal with three departments of activities. One is called Karma Kanda, or activities under Vedic injunction, which gradually purify one to understand his real position. The next is Gyan Kanda, the process of understanding the Absolute Truth by speculative method. And the third is Upasana Kanda, or worship of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and sometimes of the demigods also. The worship of the demigods recommended in the Vedas is ordered with the understanding of the demigods' relationship to the Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Personality of Godhead has many parts and parcels. Some are called swamsas, or his personal expansions, and some are called vibhin amsas, the living entities. All such expansions, both swamsas and vibhin amsas, are emanations from the original Personality of Godhead. Swamsa expansions are called Vishnu Tattva, whereas the vibhin amsa expansions are called Jiva Tattva. The different demigods are Jiva Tattva. The conditioned souls are generally put into the activities of the material world for sense gratification. Therefore, as stated in the Bhagavad Gita, to regulate those who are very much addicted to different kinds of sense gratification, the worship of demigods is sometimes recommended. For example, for persons very much addicted to meat eating, the Vedic injunction recommends that after worshipping the form of the goddess Kali and sacrificing a goat, not any other animal, under Karma Kanda regulation, the worshippers may be allowed to eat meat. The idea is not to encourage one to eat meat, but to allow one who insists on eating meat to eat it under certain restricted conditions. Therefore, worship of the demigods is not worship of the Absolute Truth, but by worshipping the demigods, one gradually comes to accept the Supreme Personality of Godhead in an indirect way. This indirect acceptance is described in the Bhagavad Gita as avidhi. Avidhi means not bona fide. Since demigod worship is not bona fide, the impersonalists stress concentration on the impersonal feature of the Absolute Truth. King Parikshit's question was, which is the ultimate target of Vedic knowledge? This concentration on the impersonal feature of the Absolute Truth, or concentration on the personal feature, After all, both the impersonal and the personal feature of the Supreme Lord are beyond our material conception. The impersonal feature of the Absolute, the Brahman effulgence, is but the rays of the personal body of Krishna. These rays of the personal body of Krishna are cast all over the creation of the Lord. And the portion of the effulgence which is covered by the material cloud is called the created cosmos of the three material qualities, Sattva, Rajas and Tamas. How can persons who are within this clouded portion, called the material world, conceive of the absolute truth by the speculative method? The answering King Parikshit's question, Sukadeva Goswami replied that the Supreme Personality of Godhead has created the mind, senses and living force of the living entity for the purpose of sense gratification and transmigration from one kind of body to another, as well as for the purpose of allowing a liberation from the material conditions. In other words, one can utilize the senses, mind and living force for sense gratification and transmigration from one body to another, or for that matter of liberation. The Vedic injunctions are there just to give the conditioned souls the chance for sense gratification under regulative principles, and thereby also to give them the chance for promotion to higher conditions of life. Ultimately, if the consciousness is purified, one comes to his original position and goes home back to Godhead. The living entity is intelligent. One therefore has to utilize his intelligence over the mind and the senses. When the mind and senses are purified by the proper use of intelligence, then the conditioned soul is liberated. Otherwise, if the intelligence is not properly utilized in controlling the senses and the mind, the conditioned soul continues to transmigrate from one kind of body to another simply for sense gratification. Another point clearly stated in the answer of Sukadeva Goswami is that it is the mind, senses and intelligence of the individual living entity that the Lord created. It is not stated that the living entities themselves were ever created. Just as the shining particles of the sun's rays always exist with the sun, the living entities exist eternally as part and parcels of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But just as the sun rays are sometimes covered by a cloud which is created by the sun, so the conditioned souls, although eternally existing as parts of the Supreme Lord, are sometimes put within the cloud of the material concept of life. In the darkness of ignorance, the whole Vedic process is to alleviate that darkened condition. Ultimately, when the senses and mind of the conditioned being are fully purified, he comes to his original position called Krishna consciousness, and that is liberation. In the Vedanta Sutra, the first sutra or quote questions about the absolute truth, Athato Brahma Jigyasa. What is the nature of the absolute truth? The next sutra answers that the nature of the absolute truth is that he is the origin of everything. Whatever we experience even in this material condition of life is but an emanation from him. The absolute truth created the mind, senses and intelligence. This means that the absolute truth is not without mind, intelligence and senses. In other words, he is not impersonal. The very word created means that he has transcendental intelligence. For example, when a father begets a child, the child has senses because the father also has senses. The child is born with hands and legs because the father also has hands and legs. Sometimes it is said that man is made after the image of God. The absolute truth is therefore the Supreme Personality of Godhead with transcendental mind, senses and intelligence. When one's mind, intelligence and senses are purified of material contamination, one can understand the original feature of the absolute truth as a person. The Vedic process is to promote the conditioned souls gradually from the mode of ignorance to the mode of passion, and from the mode of passion to the mode of goodness. In the mode of goodness, there is sufficient light for understanding things as they are. For example, from earth a tree grows, and from the wood of the tree fire is ignited. In that igniting process, we first of all find smoke, and the next stage is heat and then fire. When there is actually fire, we can utilize it for various purposes. Therefore, fire is the ultimate goal. Similarly, in the gross material stage of the life, the quality of ignorance is very prominent. Dissipation of this ignorance takes place in the gradual progress of civilization from the barbarian stage to civilized life. And when one comes to the stage of civilized life, he is said to be in the mode of passion. In the barbarian stage or in the mode of ignorance, the senses are gratified in a very crude way, whereas in the mode of passion or in civilized life, the senses are gratified in a polished manner. But when one is promoted to the mode of goodness, one can understand that the senses and the mind are engaged in material activities only due to being covered by perverted consciousness. When this perverted consciousness is gradually transformed into Krishna consciousness, then the path of liberation is opened. It is not that one is unable to approach the absolute truth by the senses and the mind. The conclusion is rather that the senses, mind and intelligence in the gross stage of contamination cannot appreciate the nature of the absolute truth. But when purified, the senses, mind and intelligence can understand what the absolute truth is. The purifying process is called devotional service or Krishna consciousness. In the Bhagavad Gita, it is clearly stated that the purpose of Vedic knowledge is to understand Krishna, and that Krishna is understood by devotional service, beginning with the process of surrender, as stated in the Bhagavad Gita. One has to think of Krishna always, one has to render loving service to Krishna always, and one always has to worship and bow down before Krishna. By this process only can one enter into the kingdom of God without any doubt. One who is enlightened in the mode of goodness by the process of devotional service is freed from the mode of ignorance and passion. In answering King Parikshit's questions, Sukadeva Goswami used the word Atmane, which indicates the stage of Brahminical qualification in which one is allowed to study the Vedic literatures known as the Upanishads. The Upanishads describe in different ways the transcendental qualities of the Supreme Lord. The Absolute Truth, the Supreme Lord, is called Nirguna. That does not mean He has no qualities. It is only because He has qualities that the conditioned living entities can have qualities. The purpose of studying the Upanishads is to understand the transcendental qualities of the Absolute Truth, as opposed to the material qualities of ignorance, passion and goodness. That is the way of Vedic understanding. Great sages like the four Kumaras headed by Sanaka followed these principles of Vedic knowledge and came gradually from impersonal understanding to the platform of personal worship of the Supreme Lord. It is therefore recommended that we must follow the great personalities. Sukadeva Goswami is also one of the great personalities, and his answer to the inquiry of Maharaj Parikshit is authorized. One who follows in the footsteps of such great personalities surely walks very easily on the path of liberation and ultimately goes back to Godhead. This is the way of perfecting this human form of life. Sukadeva Goswami continued to speak to Parikshit Maharaj, "My dear king," he said, "in this regard I shall narrate a nice story. This story is important because it is in connection with Narayana, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This narration is a conversation between Narayan Rishi and the great sage Narad Muni. Narayan Rishi still resides in Badrik Ashram, as is accepted as an incarnation of Narayana, Badrik Ashram, Narayana. Incarnation of Narayana. Badrik Ashram is situated in the northernmost part of the Himalayan mountains and is always covered with snow. Religious Indians still go to visit this place during the summer season when the snowfall is not very severe. Once when Narad, the great devotee and ascetic among the demigods, was traveling among different planets, he desired to meet the ascetic Narayan personally in Badrik Ashram and offer him respects. This great sage Incarnation of Godhead Narayana Rishi has been undergoing great penances and austerities from the very beginning of the creation to teach the inhabitants of the Bharatvarsha how to attain the highest perfectional stage of going back to Godhead. His austerities and penances are exemplary practices for the human being. The incarnation of God Narayana Rishi was sitting among many devotees in the village known as Kalapa Grama. Of course, these were not ordinary sages sitting with him, and the great sage Narad also appeared there. After offering his respects to Narayana Rishi, Narad asked him exactly the same question King Parikshit asked Sukadeva Goswami. Then the Rishi answered by following in the footsteps of his predecessors. He narrated a story of how the same question had been discussed on the planet known as Janaloka, which is above the Swargaloka planets, such as the moon and Venus. On this planet, great sages and saintly persons live, and they once discussed the same point regarding the understanding of Brahman and his real identity. The great sage Narayana began to speak. My dear Narad, he said, I shall tell you a story which took place long, long ago. There was a great meeting of the denizens of the heavenly planets, and almost all the important brahmacharis, such as the four Kumaras, Sanandana, Sanatana, Sanaka, and Sanat Kumar, attended. Their discussion was on the subject matter of understanding the absolute truth, Brahman. You were not present at that meeting because you had gone to see my expansion, Aniruddha, who lives on the island of Svetadvip. In this meeting, all great sages and brahmacharis very elaborately discussed the point about which you have asked me. And their discussion was very interesting. It was so delicate that even the Vedas were unable to answer the intricate questions raised. Continue in next video the story.